Hi folks, I'd like to give a series of quick web lectures on some of the chapters we're not going to get to in class due to Veterans Day and other events. This one is on behavior. The chapter is called Minds and Microbes, the Evolution of Behavior. So the key point of this is that behavior evolves like any other trait, and a classic example of this is a Soviet breeding program started in 1949 to breed silver foxes for fur. In Russia and other parts of the former Soviet Union, it was highly valued as fur, and foxes were difficult to keep in captivity. They're a wild animal, and they don't like behaving in a kennel. But breeding in this program found that after a few generations of selecting for behavior that allowed them to live in a kennel, they created a breed of silver fox that had many of the same traits as domesticated dogs. Foxes looked a lot like puppies, with ears that behaved like puppies, with barking rather than howling, and a number of other traits. And I've posted a YouTube video elsewhere in this week for November 11th that deals with this. And like any other trait, behavior is influenced by genes, and there are an increasing number of studies in a variety of organisms, from rodents to birds to ants to fish to bees, fruit flies, of course, and even plants, showing the genetic basis of behavioral activity. And increasingly we even understand this in the most interesting but perhaps complicated organism of all, ourselves. There are a number of studies that show that selection can act on behavior. Besides the foxes, there are studies in mice, there are studies in fruit flies, and there are studies in a number of birds where different researchers have selected on behavioral traits and increased them, or in some cases decreased them. In sticklebacks, a freshwater and marine group of fish where different streams in north temperate areas of the Pacific have been colonized independently by marine stickleback fish. As glaciers have receded, there are rapid changes in behavior as these fish adapt to freshwater environments from a marine one. And these are quite well studied, and their genetic basis is often pretty clear. In most cases, with only a few genes affecting some of these behaviors. This has been shown in mice, where groups of researchers have showed a simple genetic basis to differences in burrow structure. Biologists, have been fascinated by behavior for some time. So Tinbergen laid some of the foundation for this. We can ask a couple of questions. How does the behavior work? How does it develop in the organism? What is its adaptive value? And how did it evolve? These are different layers of questions. We can separate these in part as proximate and ultimate explanations, with the proximate being how a behavior works, what part of the brains influence it, or what external stimuli cause the behavior to be exhibited. And figuring this out is important. Why questions are about sort of what it arose from, what a common ancestor of organisms that have and don't have the behavioral trait, what in those organisms that the preceding trait did. So these are ultimately evolutionary questions about why. And part of why evolutionary theory is so important and useful for addressing any why question. So I'd like you to take away that behavior is an externally coordinated response to external stimuli. Ultimately, it's something a plant or an animal or a microbe is doing in response to something going on in its environment. It involves just like any other phenotype, and we can break our study of it into how the behavior is elicited and why the behavior may have evolved. So it's important to understand that even microorganisms have behavior. Many microorganisms, like amoebas, vary from being individual, free-living organisms to forming groups or colonies of somewhat related cells. And this has also been shown quite markedly in molds. which exhibit some fascinating behavior when they run out of resources and form fruiting bodies, where only some of the cells contribute to those fruiting bodies. And our own Lou Kim in the biology department has done some fascinating studies in this field. And it's worth noting, and here is a botanist, that plants behave too. Carnivorous plants like these flytraps and sundews have particularly notable behavior in that they're acting like animals by capturing insects primarily for nitrogen. But they also have other behaviors. As sessile organisms, plants have to develop in such a way that they respond to their external stimuli. And my own PhD dissertation was on the responses of plants, particularly impatiens, to different levels of shading, one of the important plant behaviors. So behavior is not limited to animals with nervous systems, although admittedly most of us find it most interesting in animals with nervous systems. Microbes display a range of behaviors, and plants can be sensitive to light, to touch, to nutrient levels, and can communicate by sending and receiving a variety of chemical or hormonal signals. In the animals in which most of you are likely most interesting, it's ultimately neurons that control behavior, that convey signals from the perception of external stimuli to some part of the central nervous system or brain, and then back out to the part of the body that's going to perform the behavior. And hopefully for most of you it is review how neural transmission works. If it is more new than review, I urge you to look at it before too long, simply so you understand this important part of animal biology. We find traces of nervous systems back in the Cambrian, nearly 500 million years ago, clearly indicating that multicellular animals with neurons have been around for some time. And comparing different animal groups, such as sponges and cnidarians, or jellyfish, we see an ancient origin of neurons in the rise of animals. And it's clear that the proteins involved in neural function are co-options of genes with other functions. And again, this is a place where duplications of genes has been critical in the evolution of complex traits like neurons in animals. So sponges lack neural systems, but have many of the homologous genes that are part of neurons. So sponges are marine organisms that coexist with symbiotic or essentially algae or zooxanthellae, and live as clonal organisms by both filter feeding and living off of those algae. So ctenophores, which are related to sponges and cnidarians, play a pivotal role in debates about where nervous systems arose. They may be in a clade with cnidarians, in which case nervous systems evolved once, or they may be sister to all animals, so sister to the group that's sponges, cnidarians, and animals proper, in which case either sponges lost nervous systems, which is a possibility, or they were independently gained in ctenophores. And part of this revolves on the components of their nervous system being quite different. And these groups are so ancient that long branch attraction in generating phylogenies is complicated. Either way, current evidence suggests that animal nervous systems evolved either once or twice, and even if they evolved twice, likely many parts of the nervous system were already in place in the common ancestor of both groups. The nervous system enabled complex behaviors, sort of all of the diversity of animals that we can observe, and some of these structures of the nervous system can be observed in the fossil record, as can other indications that these organisms that are fossilized must have had some of the behaviors we can observe in extant marine organisms. All right, so shifting gears a little bit, many complex behaviors are triggered by an innate sensitivity stimuli. So there are classic studies in developing seabirds showing that they have an innate sensitivity towards being stimulated by red, so that little, sort of right out of the egg, hatchlings will peck at that red dot, indicating that it's mommy. So one can paint the beaks of mother birds and do experiments looking at sort of what the stimuli that baby birds are responding to is. So very elegant studies showing that many animals have this innate sensitivity, particularly to red. The basic structure of neurons, particularly their ability to grow plastically, to develop on connections that frequently work, allows plasticity of learning. In humans, this is part of why giving young children, babies, different colors, different light to look at is so important to the development of vision or the development of walking, and particularly the development of language. In some cases, learning is expensive, so there's studies in fruit flies where they are taught to do different things, where learning seems to shorten their lifespan to some extent, suggesting that some neuronal plasticity comes at a cost. All right, so in many animals, many behaviors are innate. They're adaptive responses to predictable conditions. So innately coded behaviors may be essential, particularly for short-lived organisms. Learning does allow animals, however, to modify their behavior in response to the environment, particularly in larger animals or longer-lived animals like ourselves. And ultimately, it's synaptic plasticity that is this mechanism for learning and memory. And learning can evolve, but may involve a range of trade-offs or costs in some situations. And it's these trade-offs that we have to understand at some level to understand why different behaviors may evolve. So as we mentioned earlier, there's fossil evidence of nervous systems, including this 530 million year old fossilized brain. Invertebrates, which have larger brains, obviously, than insects or other arthropods or echinoderms, the brain has a largely conserved structure. The brainstem, a cerebellum, amygdala, and most of the cerebrum. Different parts of the brain have conserved functions in, say, processing vision or maintaining blood pressure or sort of basic bodily functions. So this relative conservation of the organization indicates that sort of brain structure is deeply conserved in animals. And nonetheless, the sort of shape of the brain, its size, and which regions are largest relative to the body size, indicates the animal's ecology. So across, say, for example, different rodents, depending on which part of the rodent, or sort of where it lives, what it eats, its relative dependence on sight versus smell, different parts of the brain may be more or less enlarged compared to others. If you look at our brain, you see the heavy emphasis on the hands and parts of the face compared to other parts of the body. All right, so our brains are divided into several regions that are conserved. All right, so shifting gear again, part of how we understand behavior, particularly one part of behavior in animals, their social organization, depends on how selection works on the animals. The easiest way to understand selection is selection on individuals. The differential fitness of individuals may cause some to outcompete others, and their genes would therefore be favored. But in many organisms, it's the social behavior that allows groups of individuals to do things that no one individual could do. And in these cases, group selection may be important. But there's a long history of debate as to whether group selection can occur or not, because selfish behavior of some individuals in a group may undermine that group behavior. And ultimately, since it's individuals that reproduce, that should go to fixation. So in debating this, the idea of an evolutionarily stable strategy was developed. This is a strategy that won't be invaded by another behavior that may favor individuals. So if some behavior of animals in a group is costly and can be invaded by individuals that cheat or don't exhibit the behavior, then it's not an evolutionarily stable strategy. This idea is part of how we have come to balance trade-offs as we analyze them in our study of behavior. So we can think of this in one way as rock, paper, and scissors in some lizards that have different mating strategies, where territories of mate garters can be usurped, but cooperative breeders that may get around that territorial garden by sneaking, and sneakers can be taken over by usurpers, and usurpers can be blocked by mate guarding, ultimately leading to a balance of these three strategies in different populations or groups of these lizards. So part of how we understand this is a balance of individual and group behavior in at least some animals, because ultimately it's individuals that reproduce. In an evolutionary stable strategy, this is an important concept that I'm likely to ask on an exam question. This is something that's adopted by a population of players and cannot be invaded by an alternative strategy. All right, so social behavior is one of the most interesting behaviors that animals exhibit. Your book has a nice table that outlines some of the different benefits and costs of it. One of the benefits of living in groups is a dilution effect, particularly against predators. We happen to have in our department dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Mike Heithaus, whose lab is at the forefront of the study of this kind of behavior in many marine animals. Another benefit of living in groups is cooperative foraging, where smaller animals can take down bigger prey by working in groups, such as in these hyenas or in wolves. Another benefit is group defense. So a single bee might not be that scary, but a cluster of hives of bees or of wasps can be quite frightening, even to a much larger animal like a bear. So these costs and benefits are an important part of group living, but ultimately the benefits may vary among individuals based on their sex, their status, and their body condition. So we can look at this in animals like meerkats or other sort of smaller ground-nesting terrestrial mammals that are often viewed as food by larger animals or by, say, predatory birds or snakes or other animals. And their group behavior is an important part of that defense, but the individuals vary in how much they help relatives. And Bill Hamilton, an evolutionary biologist in the early 60s, developed a way of thinking called kin selection that helps us understand the behavior of individuals in groups. And ultimately his idea is that the benefit to a costly behavior or an altruistic behavior that may harm the individual doing it depends on that individual's relatedness to other members of the group. So offspring are related to an individual by 50%, as are full siblings. Grandchildren and half-siblings, nephews, and nieces are related to one another by a quarter. Great-grandchildren and cousins by an eighth, a quarter of a quarter. So Hamilton famously said that he would die if it benefit. He would do something altruistic that led to his death if it led to 9 of his cousins surviving. The idea is that by saving an eighth of his own relatedness, his genes in each of those cousins, his genes would still persist if he did something altruistic himself. We can use this measure of relatedness to understand behaviors such as bees that die after they sting an enemy of the nest, to understand how they evolve. So the inclusive fitness is going to be the direct fitness of an individual plus the indirect fitness of an individual's relatives. So we can use relatedness and how other members of the group do to predict this. So we can tackle this mathematically. I'm not likely to do much with this in this class, but there's a straightforward equation so that we can understand something will evolve if the relatedness and number of benefits to those related to an individual performing a costly behavior is greater than the cost. So again, if 9 cousins live because one individual dies, it will be favored due to the benefit to those cousins and their 1/8 relatedness to the individual exhibiting the behavior. But as I just said, the benefits of this vary across individuals. So in some meerkats or other prairie dogs or other organisms, adult females tend to issue alarm calls, which are costly to the individual calling. They may be the first identified by a hawk or a snake because of their call. But they are most closely related to other females and to offspring in colonies of, say, prairie dogs. While adult males, who often aren't sure that they've are actually the parents of many of the children in a hive, because there's a social hierarchy with a few males contributing the most semen to offspring. Not all adult males make calls. They actually call less than one would expect. Similarly, first-year females do more calling than one would expect. And we can use kin selection to understand why adult females are so likely to make alarm calls. Similar studies have occurred in white-fronted bee-eaters, another fairly social bird that lives in colonies of related individuals. And part of what one needs to understand in all of this behavior is whether, particularly when men perform altruistic behavior such as parental care, their certainty of paternity matters. If they're unlikely to actually be the father of the children, they're less likely to engage in parental care. But in a wide range of animals, from a number of arthropods to clearly in humans, parental care is quite profitable. In many bird species, it takes 2 parental birds to successfully fledge a hatchling. And because of that, there's often high parental investment. All right, so kin can be recognized by a variety of means. It may be physical proximity, but in many animals there are physical features or odors that allow individuals to anthropomorphize, to know that they are related to one another. In some cases, allelic similarity may also be this. Some fascinating evidence in humans that the behavior of women to children changes based on similarity of MHC profiles. All right, so as a little bit of review, the results of personally reproducing and assisting in rearing of non-descendant kin can be genetically equivalent. We can use kin selection to understand this. So helping relatives more than non-relatives is something that kin selection theory predicts should happen, and that close relatives would be helped more than distant relatives. Parental care is a widespread form of helping, and it can be quite critical in many animals. All right, so it's worth noting that animal behaviors can be quite complex, and studying them genetically often requires some dissection of them, particularly in highly social organisms like ourselves, our close relatives like chimps, or in many cetaceans, such as dolphins. Social living clearly influences brain evolution, so the larger the groups of different apes or different primates are, they tend to have larger brains, in part because our brains are really a social organ. Uh, Tool use has evolved several times, and this is one of the most sophisticated behaviors because it requires the extensive capacity to learn to utilize a tool. And with that, I'd like to stop. I'll feature tool use more in an upcoming lecture on humans.